A black female general was just picking up her niece's graduation gown when two racist cops pulled her over, mocked her military service, and handcuffed her like a criminal. They had no idea she had a direct line to the Pentagon. 7 minutes later, an emergency alert was triggered that would destroy careers, unravel a nationwide conspiracy, and change American law forever. Stay with me. This is a story you won't believe. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from today. And if you feel something stir in you while hearing this story, something like outrage or maybe hope, don't forget to share it. Because sometimes the battle for what's right begins with a single voice saying, no more. It was just an ordinary Thursday evening in Georgia. Adrienne Blake had been driving the same country back road she grew up on, her rental car humming quietly under the golden light of early dusk. She'd flown in the day before, straight from a Pentagon briefing, to surprise her niece Autumn before graduation. The kind of trip that should have been filled with warmth, family, and the kind of nostalgia you only feel when you return to your roots. But what happened that evening would change her life and shake the foundations of a system that had grown used to trampling people like her in the dark. Her short, natural hair framed a face marked by decades of service, from the heat of Kandahar to the corridors of power in D.C. If you'd passed her on the road, you'd have thought, just another middle-aged woman heading home. And that was the point. She wasn't expecting a salute or recognition. She wasn't looking to be thanked for her 27 years of military service. She just wanted to pick up Autumn's cap and gown and head back in time for her sister's famous cornbread. That's when the blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Subtle at first, like a far-off threat you hope might just pass. But they didn't. The cruiser followed too long, too deliberately. Her military instincts kicked in, what some would call situational awareness. She checked her speed, exactly the limit. No sudden turns, no swerves. Nothing that could remotely justify what she already sensed was coming. She pulled over calmly, signaled, hazard lights blinking. Inside the car, she placed both hands on the steering wheel. Open, visible. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol, drilled into her like muscle memory. Black. Woman. Alone. On a rural road in the south. She knew the rules. But even following everyone wouldn't be enough today. Two officers approached, one older, heavy-set with the kind of authority that long outlived its usefulness. The other, younger, quiet, but already taking cues from his partner. Officer Ray Mitchum and Officer Logan Sharp, names that would soon be known far beyond Ashwood County. Mitchum's tone was confrontational from the jump. No greeting, no explanation. Just, ma'am, step out of the vehicle. Adrienne, ever calm, asked politely, Officer, may I ask why I'm being stopped? I believe I was following all traffic laws. His response was a repeat, louder this time, hand on his weapon and a gesture she'd seen countless times, in war zones, not home. Sharp chimed in then, his voice almost apologetic. We've had a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description. Silver sedan, driven by a black female. That was all it took. A lazy stereotype dressed up as probable cause. Adrienne could have protested, could have made it a scene. But she didn't. She moved slowly, carefully retrieved her documentation, license, military ID, rental agreement, and handed it over. Sharp took them. Mitchum barely looked. He scoffed. Says here she's military, Sharp mumbled. Yeah, right, Mitchum replied with a smirk. General Oprah over here thinks she's special. And that was when the handcuffs came out. Cold, tight, disrespectful. It wasn't just unlawful, it was calculated. And Adrienne knew, in that moment, this wasn't just about a stolen car report. It was about something deeper. A pattern. A sickness in the system that dressed itself in badges and uniforms and called it justice. They mocked her. Laughed. Treated her like a liar, a threat, a joke. Turn around, Mitchum barked. Hands behind your back. I've identified myself as a United States Army officer, she said evenly. I'm requesting to contact my commanding officer. Oh, we'll get to that, General Oprah, Mitchum sneered. Across the road, hidden by the trees, a young man named Darnell Washington had been walking home. He saw everything, heard enough. Pulled out his phone, hands shaking, heart pounding. He started recording, and that footage, captured in grainy, trembling defiance, would become the spark that lit a national fire. Mitchum noticed him. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" "Just walking home, sir," Darnell replied, his voice steady despite the tremor underneath. "Get over here." Darnell hesitated. He knew these woods, knew these uniforms, knew that boys like him didn't always make it home when power turned cruel. He stepped forward anyway. "Recording us?" Mitchum asked, grabbing the phone. "It's my right." The phone hit the ground hard, screen cracking, the sound of Mitchum's boot crushing it like a verdict. "Oops," he said. "Accidents happen." And then Adrian did something that changed everything. Without a word, without a blink, she activated the emergency beacon built into her smartwatch. It was encrypted, silent, instantaneous, and it triggered a classified alert back in Washington, code Black General in distress. Immediate response required. Back in the cruiser, they drove her toward the Ashwood police station. Sharp was silent. Mitchum whistled a tune, off-key and smug. Adrian stared out the window at the road she once biked as a kid, where she once believed in the good of people, the fairness of the system. It hit her then. She had fought for the idea of America. And now, in the place she called home, that idea was being strangled. In the Pentagon, a light began flashing. An officer on duty, Colonel Sarah Martinez, saw it. Froze. "Code Black," she whispered. "From Lieutenant General Adrian Blake." General Harlan Reyes was briefed minutes later. "Give me Major Marks. Prep a jet. She's not alone." Because she wasn't. And that's the part these cops didn't understand. Adrian Blake wasn't just a woman in cuffs. She was a storm with stars on her shoulders. She was every soldier who'd been silenced, every black citizen who'd been dismissed, every whistle that had gone unheard. But this time the whistle was connected to a goddamn siren at the highest levels of national command. By the time the cruiser rolled into the station, the wheels of something unstoppable had already begun to turn. If you're sitting there wondering why this matters, why the story of one woman on one quiet road should mean something to you, think about this. What if it had been your daughter, your granddaughter? What if you'd spent your life believing in the rule of law, only to find out it doesn't always apply if your skin's the wrong color? What if you'd given everything to protect your country, only to come home and be treated like you never mattered? And what would you do if you were Adrian? Because the story's just getting started. And trust me, what's coming next, well, it'll make you question everything you thought you knew about justice in America. Before she was handcuffed on a Georgia back road, before she became the face of a national reckoning, before the Pentagon scrambled jets and attorneys cleared their schedules, Adrian Blake was just Addie, a wiry little girl with scraped knees and big dreams, running barefoot through red clay fields behind her grandfather's house, daring the world to try and catch her. She grew up in Ashwood, Georgia, population small, proud, and slow to change. It was a place where people waved from porches, where everyone knew your business before you did. But it was also a town that learned to smile at her face and flinch at her name once it started appearing in military publications. There's a kind of tension that hangs around places like that, where the land is rich and the history is rotten. You can feel it in the sideways glances, the quiet at church potlucks when someone brings up the Blake girl, the way people pause a beat too long before saying you've done well for yourself. Her journey started not from a grand plan, but from desperation to escape the smallness that threatened to swallow her. Her father left when she was 10. Her mother, a nurse, worked doubles to keep food on the table. Adrian watched her mother's back bend and her spirit harden, and she promised herself she would never break like that. Not if she could help it. The military came like a lifeline. ROTC in high school, full ride to West Point. Because when you grow up black, poor, and female in a town like Ashwood, the idea of college without debt sounds like fantasy until the Army turns it into a contract. She signed that paper at 17 with hands that barely stopped shaking. West Point was a battlefield in its own way. The cold, the structure, the quiet judgment when she showed up with natural hair and a Georgia accent. But Adrian learned quickly, if they expected you to break, you stayed solid. If they bet against you, you proved them bankrupt. She was never the loudest, never the fastest, but she was always the one who didn't quit. By graduation, they knew her name. Then came the deployments. First Iraq, then Afghanistan. And then a list of places that Americans barely remember were war zones: Sudan, Syria, Ukraine. She rose fast not because she played the game, but because she redefined the rules. She wasn't just a good soldier. She was the kind of officer who learned the names of the lowest-ranked privates, the kind who dragged wounded comrades from a burning vehicle and went back for the driver, the kind who stared down tribal warlords and Pentagon brass with the same steel-eyed calm. But for all her medals and ranks, the moment that stayed with her, the one that burned hotter than explosions, wasn't in a war zone. It was during a briefing at the Pentagon when a junior officer called her sir by mistake, caught himself, and laughed, didn't realize we had Oprah in uniform. The room chuckled. Adrian didn't. She looked that boy in the eye and said, "General Blake, we'll be fine." Silence followed. The message landed. Still, it lingered. Not just that day, but every day. The constant undercurrent of being underestimated. The tightrope walk between command and tolerance. The whispered assumption that she was a diversity hire, a PR face, a token with brass on her shoulders. She swallowed it for years. Not because she accepted it, but because she knew too many people watching her were hoping she'd lose control, hoping she'd crack. And if she cracked, the dam would hold. But the truth is, her strength came from those early days in Ashwood, where the only black girl in a gifted program had to teach herself to ignore when classmates touched her hair like it was public property. Where teachers praised her articulation like it was a surprise. Where her mother taught her how to outthink, outwork, and outlast anyone who tried to put her in a box. Her mother passed 5 years ago. Heart failure. Adrian missed the funeral, stuck on a mission overseas. That regret, that guilt, never left her. So this trip back to Ashwood, it wasn't just about a graduation cap and gown. It was about penance. About looking her past in the eye and saying, "I didn't forget you." When she stepped off that plane the day before the arrest, she breathed Georgia air like a sacrament. Heavy, humid, soaked in the scent of pine and the past. Tanya, her younger sister, met her at the airport with arms that still hugged like they did when they were kids hiding under quilts during thunderstorms. Autumn, her niece, drove them home. New driver, still braking too hard, still talking a mile a minute about college, about changing the world. Adrian didn't say much on that ride. She just listened, the way you do when you're afraid the moment is too fragile to disturb. The night before the arrest, the three of them sat at the kitchen table laughing over sweet tea and biscuits. Tanya teased Adrian about how straight-laced she'd become. Autumn asked what it was like to meet the president. Adrian answered what she could. Some things she couldn't share, not because they were classified, but because they were too heavy for that warm kitchen light. She had slept in her childhood bedroom that night. The wallpaper was new. The bed creaked in the same spot it always had. On the dresser sat her mother's photo in uniform. Army nurse, Gulf War. Next to it, her own. Adrian touched the edge of the frame, a quiet salute to the woman who started it all. In the morning, they ate grits and eggs. Autumn joked about forgetting to pick up her graduation regalia. Adrian said she'd go. "I could use a little drive," she said. But the truth? She wanted a moment alone, to revisit roads that once felt endless. To remember how far she'd come and measure how much further she had to go. The rental car rolled past familiar sights, the corner store where she'd bought penny candy, the faded mural outside the old library, the spot behind the church where she and Tanya once buried a time capsule. She was tracing memories like landmarks. She felt calm. She hadn't planned for any of this to become national news. She didn't come home seeking attention. She came home to lay down the weight. But power, real power, has a way of making itself inconvenient to those who fear it. And in Ashwood, where the badge is still king and the past still whispers in back rooms, Adrian's presence wasn't just a return, it was a threat. She didn't know that Officer Ray Mitchum had read her name in the local news weeks earlier. Didn't know he'd been stewing about uppity types, trying to make Ashwood look bad. Didn't know about the forum posts he made under an alias, calling veterans like her deep state traitors and military puppets for the liberal agenda. She couldn't have known that the very system she once believed in had flagged her as a problem before she ever landed. She just wanted to pick up a cap and gown. But what she got was a moment the country would never forget. And here's the thing, friend. If you're still with me, listening from your kitchen table or your recliner chair, maybe you served too. Maybe you remember your own time in uniform. The boot polish, the chow hall smell, the silence before orders came down. If so, I'll ask you this. If they could treat a general like this, what chance does a private have? A civilian? Your grandson? And if your blood's simmering, if your gut tells you this isn't the America you were promised, that's good. Hold on to that feeling, because what's coming next is the part they never wanted you to see. The minute the cold steel clamped around her wrists, something ancient stirred in Adrian Blake. Not fear. She'd walked through fire with nothing but a rifle and resolve. Not shame. There was no shame in being black, female, or a general. What stirred was clarity. The kind that comes when the mask is finally torn off and you see the system for what it really is. There, under the yellow glare of a roadside street lamp, she saw it in the smirk on Officer Mitchum's face, the reluctant silence on Officer Sharp's lips, and the strange satisfaction that came from them reducing a woman with stars on her shoulders to a number in the back seat. But what they didn't know, couldn't have known, was that by putting her in cuffs, they had just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. As the cruiser rolled toward the station, Adrian sat with her back straight, hands still behind her. Every turn they made through the quiet Ashwood streets dug deeper into old scars. This was her town where she'd learned to ride a bike, got her first scraped knee, kissed her first crush behind the bleachers. Now it looked like something out of a different country. No, not a country, a regime. Her thoughts weren't chaotic. They were measured, precise. Survival training had taught her how to quiet her breath, slow her pulse, and assess. She had already counted the steps between her and each officer, measured the space in the cruiser, memorized the numbers on their nameplates. But she didn't fight, didn't struggle. No, Adrian had learned something more powerful than resistance, patience. And she would wait. Wait for the signal to go through. Wait for Washington to realize she was missing. Wait for justice to wake up. Back at the police station, the reception wasn't just cold, it was deliberate. Every part of the booking process was designed to strip away dignity. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sterile blue that always made people look sick. Officer Sandy Gibson, the one behind the booking desk, didn't look up as Mitchum dropped the paperwork. "What's the charge?" she asked, chewing on a toothpick. "Suspected stolen vehicle," Mitchum said, resisting non-compliance. Adrian didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction. But every cell in her body was screaming, not in fear, in memory. She remembered warlords who tried to parade prisoners for power. Remembered corrupt officials overseas who smiled while they twisted the law. And now she was seeing the same thing. Only this time it was wearing a badge with an American flag on it. Meanwhile, Officer Nia Tucker, the youngest in the department, watched from a distance. Just 6 months out of the academy, she was still green, still idealistic. Her badge still felt like something sacred. When she saw Adrian walk past, hands cuffed but head held high, she felt something twist in her gut. Nia had family who served. Her grandfather had worn a uniform in Vietnam. He told her stories, not just about the enemy abroad, but the ones they'd faced at home. The men who called them slurs while they wore the same patch. She recognized the posture in Adrian, the calm defiance of someone who had been through storms worse than this. Inside the holding cell, Adrian sat on the cold bench, alone. The smell of bleach lingered in the air. Someone down the hall hummed an old blues tune off-key. She looked at the concrete walls and thought of the bunkers overseas, thought of the brothers and sisters she'd lost in combat, thought of the time she'd come home draped in flags, thinking her country had finally changed. And then she looked at her wrist, now bare, watch confiscated, and remembered the code was sent. She had 7 minutes. Then it would reach the Pentagon. She had 7 minutes. Then it would reach the Pentagon. And she knew one of ours is in trouble. Send everything. Miles away in a small apartment near Ashwood Community College, Darnell Washington sat with his friend Marcus, a tech whiz with glasses too big for his face and fingers that never stopped typing. They had managed to extract the video from Darnell's cloud backup. It wasn't just a clip, it was the full encounter. Adrian's calm voice, the mocking tone of Mitchum, the crushing of the phone. Marcus uploaded it with a hashtag #LatianCuffs. He didn't expect it to blow up. But within hours, it had. Thousands of views, shares from military families, tweets from civil rights lawyers, comments flooding in, "This is America in 2025. I served with her in Kandahar. We see you, General Blake." Back at the Pentagon, the alert had reached Colonel Sarah Martinez. She immediately pulled up Adrian's profile. Decorated, respected, 3 tours, no red flags, the kind of record they made movies about. And now her signal was coming from a small-town jail. General Harlan Reyes was briefed within minutes. "Send the jet," he said, "and get me Owen Marks, because if there was one man who'd move heaven and earth for Adrian, it was Owen. She'd saved his life in Afghanistan, pulled him out of a burning vehicle when everyone else said it was too late. That kind of debt doesn't fade." At the Ashwood station, tension hung thick. Mitchum strutted through the halls like a man who'd just shot a trophy buck. He boasted to the others in the break room about putting someone in their place. "General, my ass," he sneered. "She'll be lucky to see daylight before Monday." Nia Tucker, standing just outside, heard every word. She didn't say anything, but later she found a quiet corner and started recording notes on her phone. Facts, observations, names. Because something told her this wasn't over, and she'd be damned if she let it get buried. In the cell, Adrian didn't sleep, didn't blink. She recited her oath quietly under her breath, to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It was no longer just words, it was the heartbeat of her resistance. Because the enemy wasn't across an ocean, it was across a hallway. When the phone finally rang at the front desk, Sandy Gibson answered, her voice thick with boredom. But her face changed. The voice on the other end wasn't asking. It was ordering. 15 minutes later, Chief Barbara Straude walked through the station's front door. Her arrival wasn't routine. It was damage control. And when she walked past the holding cells, glanced at Adrian, then back at her officers, something unspoken passed between them. This woman was more than they thought. And someone, somewhere, was very angry. But here's the thing, Adrian never raised her voice, never threatened, never begged. She knew who she was. And that knowledge was power, a quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. And in the end, it was that calm, that unshakable center that made the entire machine begin to crack. Now, if you're listening and your hands are clenched or jaw tight, your heart pounding a little faster, that's not anger. That's memory. That's knowing. That's remembering what you swore when you took your oath, whether it was in 1965 or 2005. And it's time we remember that an oath doesn't expire when the uniform comes off. It follows us. It calls us. It says, do something. So sit tight, my friend. Because chapter 4, that's when the Empire begins to panic. At 3:17 a.m., the lights in the Ashwood Police Department flickered once, then held. Adrian Blake sat in her holding cell, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the wall in front of her, not because she was afraid, but because she knew. The call had gone out. The Pentagon was awake. And if the people in this building thought the storm was over, they hadn't seen a hurricane before. But even a hurricane starts with silence, and in that silence, Adrienne braced herself for what would come next, not just for her, but for the nation that had just tried to break her. Chief Barbara Straude had arrived an hour earlier, looking like a woman who'd been woken from a warm bed and told that the walls were closing in. She hadn't spoken to Adrienne, hadn't made eye contact, but she had spent 23 minutes behind a closed office door on the phone with someone from the state attorney general's office. Her voice tense, clipped, and increasingly panicked. Whatever she thought this was, a traffic stop gone wrong, an overzealous officer playing cowboy, it was slipping through her fingers. Because the name Adrienne Blake had started ringing in rooms she didn't even know existed. And people with stars on their collars were demanding answers. In the break room, Officer Mitchum sat with his boots up, sipping coffee like nothing had changed. "They're making a big deal out of nothing," he grumbled. "She's just trying to pull rank to get out of a ticket." But the edges of his voice were fraying. Sharp, his partner, hadn't spoken in over an hour. He sat at the end of the table, fingers trembling just slightly, eyes staring at the table like it held the answer to a test he hadn't studied for. He kept replaying the moment he put those cuffs on her wrists, the way she'd said, "You don't know what you've just done." And now, sitting in the aftermath, he was starting to believe her. But outside that building, the world was shifting. Darnell Washington's video had spread like wildfire, not just to social media, but to newsrooms, veterans forums, military groups. And what they saw wasn't just a woman being arrested. It was a general being humiliated by men half her caliber. It struck a chord deep in the bones of Americans who had worn the uniform. The ones who remembered saluting the flag not because it was trendy, but because it meant something. And now, those people were asking a question no department wanted to hear. What the hell are you doing to our own? By morning, Adrienne hadn't moved. Not an inch. She'd practiced that kind of stillness in combat zones where every breath could give away your position. It wasn't about fear. It was about control. And as much as they tried to strip her of that with shackles and taunts, they hadn't even scratched the surface. Officer Nia Tucker walked past her cell around 6:30 a.m., coffee in hand, sleep still clinging to her face. But when their eyes met, Nia stopped. There was no anger in Adrienne's gaze, just something heavier, something like expectation. Nia didn't know it yet, but she'd remember that look for the rest of her life. Later that morning, the department received its third phone call from Washington. This time it wasn't a junior staffer. It was General Harlan Reyes. His voice, deep and direct, came through the speakerphone in Straude's office like thunder wrapped in velvet. "Release Lieutenant General Adrienne Blake immediately," he said, "and prepare all reports for federal review. Failure to comply will result in military intervention." Straude tried to push back, citing jurisdiction, procedure, due process, but Reyes wasn't listening. "You arrested a decorated officer of the United States Army without cause," he said. "You're not dealing with a citizen anymore. You're dealing with a symbol, and we take care of our symbols." Straude hung up with a hand that trembled slightly, and for the first time in years, the mask cracked. She knew what was coming wasn't just a legal review. It was a reckoning, and she was standing directly in its path. An hour later, Adrienne was released. No apology, no explanation. Just handed her belongings like a customer returning a broken appliance. As she stepped out into the morning light, cameras flashed. A crowd had gathered. Protesters with hand-drawn signs. Veterans standing shoulder to shoulder in their dress blues. Autumn and Tanya waiting with arms that pulled her in like a lifeline. Adrienne didn't speak, didn't wave. She just walked to the car like the soldier she was, head high, boots silent, eyes forward. But inside, something had shifted. She had seen the inside of a cell meant to erase people, had felt the cold calculation of men who thought they could get away with it. And she had watched the machine try to spin a lie around her story. And that's when she decided this wasn't over, not even close. Back at the station, Straude tried to contain the damage. She called a press conference. stood at a podium and read from a carefully worded statement about procedural misunderstandings and commitment to justice. But the questions came fast and sharp. Why wasn't the general's identity verified? Why was her documentation ignored? And why was a black woman in civilian clothes treated like an enemy combatant on her home soil? And Strahd had no answers. Because the truth was this: they hadn't cared who she was. They saw her skin before her stars, saw her gender before her rank, and they acted not out of fear, but out of entitlement. The same entitlement that whispers in dark corners of locker rooms, that justifies cruelty with policy, that believes justice is something you get to give or take away. But Adrian wasn't just walking away. No, she was walking towards something. She made calls to friends and media, to senators she'd briefed, to generals who owed her more than they could say. And the machine that had tried to crush her, she was going to make it choke on the truth. And my friend, if you're still with me, if you've followed this story from the dusty backroads of Georgia to the halls of power, I need you to hear this next part loud and clear. This wasn't a mistake. It was a mirror. And it's showing us who we are, what we accept, what we ignore, and what we're willing to do when the people we swore to protect are the ones being betrayed. Because Adrian's fight, it's not just hers anymore. It's ours. And we've only just begun. Adrian Blake didn't sleep that night, while the town of Ashwood lay quiet under a blanket of southern fog, while the streetlights buzzed like tired sentries over empty roads. She sat in her childhood bedroom, wide awake, staring at the ceiling like it held secrets only war could teach you to read. Her sister had tried to get her to eat something. Her niece had curled up beside her for a while, before drifting off, safe in the way only the young can be after a storm. But Adrian couldn't rest. Not because she was afraid, but because something had shifted deeply and permanently. The battle had changed. And now the enemy was wearing her country's colors. In her right hand, she held her military watch, the same one they'd returned to her in a plastic bag, like it was evidence of a crime. She turned it over, stared at the faint scratch across its face. That scratch hadn't come from Ashwood. It had come from a fall in Kandahar when she'd pulled a wounded soldier out from under gunfire. That young man, Owen Marks, now worked inside the Pentagon's most secure intelligence unit, and as she stared into that scratch, Adrian made her first move. She tapped a secured line on her secondary device and waited for the encrypted channel to connect. When Owen's voice came through, rough from sleep, she said only 5 words. They made it personal, Owen. He was silent for a beat, then answered, "We're already on it." In Washington, the wheels had already begun to turn. Not the official wheels, the slow, squeaky cogs of bureaucracy, but the quiet ones, the ones that spin behind locked doors where classified reports change hands and coffee is sipped from mugs labeled top secret. Owen had seen the alert the moment it came through. But it wasn't just the alert that had haunted him. It was the silence that followed. No record of arrest. No official report. The Ashwood police system had gone dark for 3 hours. Someone had wiped logs, tampered with surveillance, and sealed every trace behind layers of false entries. Owen had seen this before, but overseas. In failed states. In corrupt border towns where local warlords scrubbed data to cover abuse. But this was Georgia, and that terrified him more than anything. He looped in Falcon, an anonymous intel contact with deep digital reach. Nobody knew Falcon's real name, but they knew he had once walked the halls of the NSA, knew how to enter systems without leaving fingerprints. Falcon didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'll find what they buried." Meanwhile, Adrian made her next call to Jeremiah Cole, a civil rights attorney in Atlanta known for 2 things: never losing and never backing down. Years ago, Adrian had helped his brother's unit out of a hostage situation overseas. The debt was unspoken. Until now. "I need someone who's not afraid to fight," Adrian said. "I only fight," Cole replied. "What's our target?" "Not just the officers. Not just the department," she said. "The system that lets them think they can silence people like me without consequence." And just like that, the alliance was born. But as Adrian plotted her response, the opposition moved too. Back in Ashwood, Chief Straude had received her own set of calls, not from the governor, not from the press, but from a man named Senator Roland Wexley, whose voice carried the slow venom of a man used to pulling strings. "Keep it quiet," he said. "Discredit her if you have to. We can't let this become a symbol." "She already is," Straude had replied. "Then cut her down before she grows wings," Wexley hissed. "Because that's what frightened them. Not the arrest. Not even the video. It was the idea that a black female general, humiliated in her own hometown, could become a rallying cry. They knew the power of story, and they were terrified of hers. So the smear campaign began. Within 48 hours, blogs started publishing leaked allegations. Anonymous sources questioned her military conduct. A fabricated report surfaced online suggesting a prior incident of insubordination that had been quietly resolved. Cable news ran with it. Some anchors used careful language. "We're not saying she's guilty, but questions remain." Others were bolder, accusing her of exploiting her race and rank for personal gain. But the problem with lies is they don't stand long in the presence of truth. Falcon cracked into a server buried behind 3 firewalls in the Ashwood department. What he found stunned even him. Internal email showed that Officer Mitchum had accessed Adrian's travel history days before the stop. He had known she was coming, known the route she would take. The traffic stop wasn't a reaction. It was an ambush. Falcon didn't stop there. He uncovered forum posts where Mitchum had bragged about reminding elites who really runs these towns. Other posts linked him to a shadowy militia group, Iron Oak, operating under the radar across several southern counties. Their doctrine: restore traditional order. Their targets: minority leaders, reform-minded officers, and veterans who challenged authority. Adrian had done all 3. Owen passed the data to General Reyes. Reyes had known Adrian since her first deployment, had watched her grow from a sharp young officer into one of the most trusted leaders in the field. When he read the files, he didn't get angry. He got surgical. "We're initiating an internal task force," he told the room. "This isn't just about one general. This is about an infection inside our own house." But Adrian didn't wait for clearance. She went public. The day after her release, she stood on the steps of the Georgia State Capitol, flanked by veterans, activists, and a crowd that had grown from a handful to hundreds. She didn't shout, didn't rage. She spoke in the calm, commanding tone of a woman who had faced gunfire and lived to tell about it. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about every American who's ever been told they're too much, too loud, too proud, too black, too female, too different. I didn't serve this country for the uniform. I served it for the Constitution. And that doesn't stop just because someone in power gets uncomfortable." The crowd erupted. Hashtags trended. Donations poured into Cole's legal fund. Adrian Blake was no longer just a general. She was a movement. And that's when the threat started. Letters sent to her sister's house, messages to her niece's school, anonymous calls with veiled warnings. But Adrian didn't flinch. She'd stood on the front lines of war. She wasn't about to be scared off by cowards with burner phones. Instead, she doubled down. She met privately with Nia Tucker, the young officer from the station. Nia looked different now, haunted, hesitant, but she had something. A flash drive. Recordings she'd made. Mitchum bragging. Straude covering. Sharp, whispering doubts. Nia slid it across the table. "I want to do the right thing," she said. "Even if it ruins me." Adrian placed a hand on hers. "Then you're already winning." And so, the battle lines were drawn. On one side, a network of corruption, power, and fear. On the other, a woman they couldn't break and a nation beginning to listen. If you've been following this story, if your gut is burning and your fists are clenched good, it means you're still alive in a country that tried to numb you. It means you remember what you stood for when you first swore your oath. Because this fight isn't about race, or gender, or even one traffic stop in Georgia. It's about the soul of the Republic. And Adrian Blake? She's not finished. Not even close. Nia Tucker didn't know fear until the night she found a dead bird nailed to her front door. It wasn't the gore that shook her. It was the silence, the message, the deliberate, primitive warning. That night, she sat on her porch with a baseball bat across her lap and a flashlight in her hand, staring at the trees while her mother cried quietly in the kitchen. This wasn't a scare tactic from teenagers. This was a message from men with badges and secrets, and it confirmed what she'd feared since slipping that flash drive into Adrian Blake's hand. Telling the truth had made her a target. But somewhere beneath the terror lived something stronger, pride. Pride that she had chosen integrity over comfort. Pride that she'd broken the silence that suffocated her department for years. And that pride carried her through the next day when she was summoned to internal affairs. Adrian, meanwhile, was already 3 steps ahead. She'd spent the last 48 hours coordinating with Jeremiah Cole and General Reyes, building a strategy that was equal parts legal war room and battlefield command. Cole had filed the first federal lawsuit under the Civil Rights Act, naming officers Mitchum and Sharp, Chief Straude, and the Ashwood Police Department. But Adrian wasn't content with just naming names. She wanted systems. She wanted the rot cut out at the roots. So Reyes, with the blessing of the Secretary of Defense, greenlit a task force codenamed Sentinel to investigate extremist infiltration of local police units. And Nia's flash drive was their first weapon. The recordings were worse than expected. Mitchum calling Adrian uppity trash. Straude saying, "We need to remind people who runs this town." Sharp's quiet voice, "I don't know about this." She had the ID. This ain't right. And most damning of all, a late-night conversation between Straude and an unknown male voice. What if she fights back? "Then we bury her," the voice said. "Not just in the media. For real, if we have to." Falcon, the anonymous digital operative working with Owen Marks, traced that voice. It belonged to a man named Calvin Dees, ex-military, now head of security consulting for Sovereign Security Solutions, a private contractor with ties to law enforcement grants across the South. Falcon's files revealed something chilling. Sovereign Security had quietly received millions in federal funding to provide cultural threat training to small-town police departments. Their ideology was buried in coded language, preserving traditional values, combating urban unrest, reinforcing lawful hierarchies. But their targets? Always the same. Black leaders, progressive veterans, outspoken activists. Adrian stared at the printed documents late one night, the rain tapping on the windows like distant artillery fire. "They weren't trying to silence me," she said to Owen over a secure call. "They were testing their system, seeing how far they could go before someone fought back." Owen replied, "Then you're not just a victim. You're a breach in their firewall." And that's exactly how Adrian began treating herself, not as a symbol of injustice, but as a strategic threat to an underground operation threatening American democracy from within. Publicly, the movement swelled. The hashtag #JusticeForGeneral trended for 10 days straight. Adrian's CNN interview went viral. "I didn't ask for this fight, but I won't walk away from it." Not when the stakes are this high. Not when silence equals complicity. She wasn't yelling. She never did. But her tone, the calm, unwavering authority in her voice, struck a nerve. Veterans groups rallied behind her. Military families shared their own stories of discrimination. Students held walkouts. Even conservative-leaning outlets began cautiously admitting something was very wrong in Ashwood, and that's when the counterattack began. First, it was a deepfake video, crudely doctored to show Adrian yelling anti-police rhetoric at a protest she never attended. Then came an anonymous op-ed, alleging she had once falsified deployment records to earn a commendation. Jeremiah Cole shredded the claims on national television. "This isn't a smear campaign," he said. "This is a panic response from men who thought their power was permanent, but the attacks kept coming. Autumn, Adrian's niece, was followed leaving campus. Tanya's tires were slashed. Someone hacked Adrian's military email, planting false messages to discredit her. For every blow, Adrian struck back harder. General Reyes used the Sentinel Task Force to expose more departments infected with sovereign security ties. The DOJ opened a criminal investigation into the company's contracting practices. Whistleblowers came forward, officers from Mississippi, Kentucky, Texas, all sharing the same story: racist training, intimidation of minorities, silencing of reform-minded cops. Adrian was no longer alone. She was a spark lighting torches in towns across America. But even with the progress, the danger was real. Mitchum had disappeared. Sharp had resigned, but was now under protective custody after admitting he'd been told to make the stop stick. Straude was still chief, but under state review. And Adrian? She carried a loaded weapon every time she stepped outside her house. Not because she wanted to, but because the people who once swore oaths to protect the Constitution had become its greatest threat. And yet, something beautiful began to grow from the wreckage. Nia Tucker, though reassigned to desk duty, became a voice for ethical policing. She was invited to speak at colleges, on panels, even on a special military ethics summit. Her words were simple, but powerful. I thought the badge made me untouchable. I was wrong. What makes you strong isn't the badge. It's what you do when wearing it means standing alone, and for Adrian, the next move came quietly, unexpectedly, a call from West Point. They wanted her to speak at graduation. Not just as a general, but as a living lesson. She agreed. Her speech didn't make headlines because it screamed. It made headlines because it whispered truth in a room full of new officers, with their whole futures ahead of them. When you wear this uniform, she told the cadets, you don't just serve a country. You serve an idea, an imperfect one, an evolving one, but one worth fighting for. And if you ever forget who you serve or why, that's when the real enemy wins. And if you've made it this far, listening from your living room, maybe your old service photo sitting on a nearby shelf, maybe your hands calloused from years of building, defending, fixing this country, then you understand this better than most. This isn't just her battle. It's ours. Because the flag doesn't mean anything if it only protects the powerful. And oaths? Oaths don't expire. They echo. They echo. They wait. And sometimes they call you back into the fight. So stand by, old soldier. Because Chapter 7, that's when the Empire begins to bleed. And the truth starts roaring. Adrian Blake stood behind the tinted glass of a federal courtroom, watching the machinery of justice turn with a sound so slow it was almost silent. She wasn't in uniform. Not today. Today she wore a plain charcoal suit, no medals, no rank, no armor, because sometimes the truth needed to walk in looking like the people it was trying to save. Across from her sat Senator Roland Wexley, flanked by lawyers, hollow-eyed and tight-lipped. To his right, Chief Straude, whose carefully painted smile had begun to chip under the weight of leaked recordings and witness testimony. And beside her, calm and sharp like a blade honed in fire, sat Attorney Jeremiah Cole, flipping through files that had the weight of 1,000 broken lives between their pages. They were here not just for her, but for every veteran who'd been silenced, every citizen arrested for the color of their skin, every whistleblower labeled a traitor for loving their country more than they feared its institutions. And watching it unfold, Adrian didn't feel vindicated. She felt responsible. It had taken months to get here. Falcon, now revealed as Lucian Graves, a former NSA analyst turned Patriot rogue, had dropped a final file that broke the case wide open. A conversation intercepted at a private hunting lodge. Grainy audio. Low voices, but unmistakable. She's too visible now, said Wexley. We discredit her, or we neutralize her. If that doesn't work, came the reply, we move to permanent solutions. The other voice was identified later. General Preston Kane, Adrienne's former mentor. A man who once pinned her first star on her collar. A man who had once told her, we stand for honor even when no one's watching. And now here he was, caught on tape planning her political assassination, and maybe worse. The evidence triggered a cascade of panic within the Shadow Network. Secure servers were scrubbed, financial accounts drained, and one mid-level operative tried to flee the country through Canada before being stopped by a no-fly red alert tied directly to Adrienne's case file. But it was too late. The dam had burst. The recordings aired on national television during a prime-time broadcast. and something happened that no one expected. Americans, tired, cynical, distracted, sat up and listened. The image of a four-star general calmly facing down her own betrayal by the government she had served lit a fire that even the most carefully crafted propaganda couldn't extinguish. And while the headlines screamed, Adrian went quiet. She didn't do a press tour, didn't capitalize on outrage. Instead, she went to work. She met with survivors of police abuse, with young activists, with retired officers who had left the force in protest of corruption. She listened, and that listening changed her. It made her realize this wasn't just a military story. It wasn't just about protocol or power. It was about people, all people. And she was now their unlikely voice. But not everyone wanted her to speak. A week before the federal trial began, Autumn was followed again, this time by men who didn't try to hide it. Their car idled outside her apartment for 2 nights. Then, on the third, her roommate came home to find their door jimmied open and a USB drive left in the middle of the floor. When plugged into a safe machine, the drive displayed a single message: walk away or she doesn't graduate alive. They called the FBI. Within hours, protective detail was assigned. But Adrian knew what that meant. It meant the enemy was scared, and scared men make mistakes. Owen Marks tracked the threat down to a messaging channel buried in the dark web. Cross-referencing IP addresses with known militia affiliates, he discovered chatter about a failed plan to remove the general's bloodline. The words were chilling, but they were also proof. This wasn't random hate. It was organized, strategic violence. And so, Adrian made her final move before the trial. She went to Arlington, stood before a field of graves in full dress blues, and filmed a message for the American people. No production crew, no teleprompter, just a camera, a flag, and the weight of history. I wore this uniform for 27 years, she said, her voice calm, not to get special treatment, not to be feared. I wore it because I believe in a country that keeps its promises. I still believe in that country. But belief isn't enough. It has to be protected. And sometimes protected from the inside. The video hit 10 million views in 24 hours. But more importantly, it reached the one place she needed it to, Capitol Hill. Under pressure from constituents, 4 senators broke ranks and publicly supported the investigation into sovereign security's influence. One, a veteran of the Gulf War, said, "I didn't survive a roadside bomb in Iraq to watch the Constitution be hijacked in Georgia." And when he said it, you could almost feel the shift, as if the gears of government, long rusted by cowardice, had finally begun to grind forward. Back in the courtroom, Nia Tucker was the first to testify. She wore her badge, even though the department had since suspended her. She recounted everything: the slurs, the pressure, the day she realized her oath meant standing alone in a room full of silence. She played the recordings for the court. People wept. Some gasped. Even Straude flinched. Then came Falcon, Lucian Graves, testifying in person for the first time. He explained how the network operated, how taxpayer money had been funneled into training programs designed to radicalize law enforcement, how data on military veterans, civil rights leaders, and minority influencers was collected and shared on internal servers, how Adrienne's travel to Ashwood had been tracked weeks before she arrived. And then he said the words that shattered the illusion: they weren't planning to stop with her. Jeremiah Cole laid it all out in closing arguments. "This isn't about a traffic stop," he said, pacing slowly. "This is about what happens when fear meets power, when patriots become targets, when silence becomes survival, and when one woman decides enough is enough." And the jury listened. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the room didn't erupt. It exhaled, like a nation unclenching its jaw after holding it shut for too long. Wexley was taken into custody, Straude removed in handcuffs. Kane, his rank stripped, stared straight ahead, unmoved. Outside, Adrian stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by people holding signs, flags, and candles. She raised her hand, not in victory, but in solidarity. "We didn't win today," she said. "We started. And if you're hearing this, brother, if you remember what it means to stand when others sit, if you've ever worn a patch over your heart and believed it meant something, then know this: the country's still ours. Not the men in back rooms, not the ones who hide behind suits and badges in fear. It belongs to the people who show up, who speak out, who fight the long fight even when no one's watching. Because freedom isn't a gift, it's a responsibility." And Adrian Blake? She picked it up with both hands. "And now it's our turn." They gathered beneath a sky that was neither blue nor gray, but the dull, quiet kind of morning light that makes you feel like something sacred is about to happen. The White House lawn was freshly trimmed, the flag above it hanging motionless in the still spring air. Lined shoulder to shoulder on the stage were veterans in dress uniform, civil rights leaders in tailored suits, and young officers just beginning their service. But at the center, flanked by no security detail, no rank insignia, and no podium, just the quiet weight of history, stood Lieutenant General Adrian Blake. In her hands, she held a single folded flag, not for the fallen, but for the ones who refused to fall. She wasn't here to mourn. She was here to pass the torch. It had been 6 months since the verdict. 6 months since the country watched powerful men crumble beneath the truth. Since the network that had tried to bury her was exposed, disbanded, and brought before the American people, not in shadows, but in open court. 6 months since the media had stopped calling her a symbol of justice and started calling her what she always had been, a soldier who kept her oath when others forgot theirs. Today was her final act in uniform. Her retirement ceremony, but not in the usual place. No Pentagon ballroom, no brass band, no quiet reception for generals and dignitaries. No, Adrian had asked to stand here, in the open, with the people, because this story didn't belong behind closed doors. Not anymore. President Matthews stepped forward, holding a pen instead of a speech. He didn't speak first. He just looked at her, a long, steady look that carried the weight of every veteran who had once believed that rank made you untouchable. And then he turned to the table beside them and signed into law the Blake-Tucker Act, a comprehensive police reform bill designed to do more than punish. It would prevent. Body cameras required in every department. Federal background checks for law enforcement officers. Training reforms. Whistleblower protections. And a clause that made lying under oath in civil rights cases a federal crime. It wasn't perfect. No bill ever is. But it was a start, and the country saw it as a promise, one made under a flag that still had work to do. Adrian didn't speak until the crowd had gone quiet. When she did, she didn't use a microphone. Her voice was clear enough to carry without one. "I was taught that leadership means walking into fire first," she began, "that it means bearing the burden so others don't have to. But what I've learned these last months is something deeper. Leadership isn't just walking through the fire. It's choosing to walk back into it again and again until the fire dies. Even when you're tired, even when you're scared, even when you think you're the last one standing." She paused then, eyes scanning the crowd. A boy in a wheelchair, saluting. An old woman clutching a photo of her son. Nia Tucker in full dress blues, flanked by a dozen officers who had left their departments to join her National Ethics Force. Owen Marks, standing at the edge of the platform, his face tired but proud. "You all stood with me," she said, her voice softer now. "And I will never forget that. But standing with me isn't enough. Standing for justice, for truth, for each other, that's the real work. And it doesn't end because a law was passed or a case was closed. It begins again, every morning, every conversation, every silence you break. This flag belongs to you now, so carry it well." She stepped back, and the crowd rose, not with applause, but with something heavier. A silence of respect, of understanding, of a burden shared. But Adrian wasn't done. 3 weeks later, at Arlington National Cemetery, they held a separate ceremony. One not broadcast, not printed in the papers. This one was for those who never got to see the victory. They laid stones for Logan Sharp and Virginia Cross, whose quiet acts of courage had turned the tide. They read letters from whistleblowers too scared to come forward in public. And Adrian stood again, this time beside Nia, both of them holding a memorial plaque etched with 5 names, names of civilians wrongly arrested, detained, or injured by the Ashwood Department over the last decade. None of them had ever seen a courtroom. Until now.